My name is Heath McMichael and I'm branch president. Tonight, we are pleased to launch a new book on Anglo-Australian involvement in the Second Iraq War in 2003. National President of the AIIA, Alan Ginter, co-authors. Make matters interesting, as you can see, Mark is coming through on Zoom from London. So please bear with us as we put our new audio-visual setup through its paces. Judy Betts teaches government and political communication at the University of Technology, Sydney. She's worked in the Federal Departments of Finance Administration, Prime Minister and Cabinet, and Immigration and Ethnic Affairs, and in the corporate sector for the Commonwealth Bank and IBM Australia. Judy co-wrote the book we are launching, The Iraq War and Democratic Governance, Britain and Australia, drawing on her 2015 PhD thesis, which she submitted to the University of Sydney. Mark Fithian is the other co-author and Professor of Politics at the University of Leicester. He writes prolifically on intelligence and security matters and is a Fellow of the UK Academy of Sciences. We're very pleased he can join us this morning in the UK. Alan Ginter has a long career in foreign and intelligence policy as Prime Ministerial International Advisor and Director General of the Office of National Assessments. Outside government, he was the founding director of the Lowy Institute for International Policy and has written extensively on Australia's foreign relations. He's the author of the acclaimed Fear of Abandonment, Australia in the World Since 1942, published in 2017. Now, following the conversation, I'll curate questions from our in-house audience, that's you guys, and our online participants via the Q&A function on Zoom. We'll aim to get through as many questions as we can and finish at 7 p.m. So without any further ado, let me hand over to Alan to begin the conversation.
Thank you very much, Heath. It's wonderful to be here. In my experience, there are a few things happier than launching books, unless they're launching books written by old friends, as Judy at least is. Judy and I was just thinking, Judy, we were both in PMNC at the time of the first Gulf War, the successful one, the one that really worked, in contrast to the one that you then started writing about. Look, I think this book, which I've read and thoroughly enjoyed, and which is available to anyone who goes onto the Palgrave Macmillan website for a special discounted cost. I'm told 20% off. Is really well, surprisingly maybe the wrong word, but it is certainly increasingly relevant at a time when talk about the drums of war and the US alliance is circulating all around this capital, at least. I don't know, Mark, whether it's so loud in London at the moment. But there are relevant lessons for the present time, I think, to take out of this. So, Judy, we'll talk for about 25 minutes, as Heath said, and then hand over to the audience here. But why don't we start with how come we have a book about the Iraq War and democratic governance from the perspective of Australia and the UK? How did you two come together?
When I was thinking about doing a PhD, I was sort of told it had to be something that was going to keep me actively engaged for 7 years. The task took 7 years. And the Iraq War was a topic that had been of enormous interest to me. When I was working with Alan, I was actually on the Middle East desk in the international division. And when the war broke out, I remembered thinking, gosh, if I'd been on that desk now, what would I have been writing to the Prime Minister? You know, what would our position have been? And so I decided to do my PhD thesis on the media's coverage of our involvement in the Iraq War. But the thing that really struck me out of the thesis was that there was more than just, there was a bigger story here. It wasn't just about the media coverage, it was about governance itself. And when I mean governance, I'm talking about the processes, and the procedures for making decisions, but then also institutions like the media and Parliament that are there to hold our elected representatives to account. And so I wanted to have a really holistic view of what was going on. But my supervisor, Rod Tiffin, had done some work with Mark Vivian in London, and he suggested that there might be value added if we coordinate something. And I think that the book is much more insightful by virtue of having the British perspective and alongside the Australian perspective.
Yeah. Mark, one of the things that comes through so clearly in the book, and surprisingly for me anyway, is that these two close allies of the United States both interpreted their responsibilities under the alliance in different ways. So the fascinating differences between Blair and Howard come out in your work. Can you just talk a bit about what drove the United Kingdom decision to enter the Iraq War?
Thanks. Yes, I think one thing I'd point to as being a difference, a key difference, is the greater significance of Blair's sense of foreign policy vision, the greater role of ideas in his commitment to the Iraq War. I mean, Blair set these out clearly as long ago as 1999 in his Doctrine of the International Community speech in Chicago. And even in that speech, he was citing Saddam as a dangerous and ruthless man who was the source of many of the world's problems. And in that speech, he also set out the conditions under which he believed it was permissible for Western states to intervene militarily in other parts of the world. And one of the ironies of the 2003 Iraq War is that if that Blair had actually stuck to his own criteria, then Britain would not have taken part in the invasion in 2003. So I'd say there's more of a pronounced ideological component for Blair than perhaps for Howard. Once you link this to Blair's deep attachment to the example of the United States, Blair's Labour Party took enormous inspiration from the Clinton New Democrats in the United States, and his deep attachment to the idea of the special relationship with the United States. Then you've got an issue where Blair fervently believed in the idea of intervention and that Saddam was a threat. And as an ally, he had no reason to decouple from the US commitment to overthrow Saddam. And I think both of those things had to be present for the UK to take part in the invasion. It required both Blair's fervent commitment in the sense of ideas and also his belief in the special relationship. The example of the Harold Wilson government in Vietnam in the 1960s show that alternatives were possible. You could decouple from the US. It was messy, it came at a price, but you could do it. But I think the combination of Blair's personal beliefs and his commitment to the alliance, kind of shaped the decision.
If values, as you say, drove much of the UK decision making, it was interests that were very heavily on John Howard's minds in all this. So, how did you, Judy, contrast the reasons for Howard's decision to get into the war?
I think right from the very beginning, Howard always wanted to build a close relationship with Bush, particularly since his relationship with Clinton was not all that warm. But he was in Washington at the time of the 9/11 attacks. So I think that meant that there was a sort of a deep emotional attachment. The day after the attacks, he had been scheduled to speak to Congress, and he decided not to speak, but visited the Congress and got a standing ovation. So there are a whole lot of kind of emotional things there about closeness to the US. On the way home from the US, after 9/11, he invoked the ANZUS Treaty and said that we would provide support to the US. And it was not long after that that they decided to invade Afghanistan, and we were part of that group as well. So I think, but nonetheless, when Iraq came along, I think that what happened was that Howard gave a private undertaking to Bush before there had been any actual process in Australia of, being advised and briefed by the bureaucracy, and before there had been any sort of deep consideration of that issue. But he was very, very determined to be part of the alliance and to strengthen the alliance, to have a very close relationship with Bush. But it was also an issue on which he could sort of wedge Labor, and he knew that there'd be people in Labor who were uncomfortable about any kind of military adventure. But that said, despite his emotional and political commitment to the alliance, his military commitment, when it came to the time, was probably as small as he could get away with. He only committed 2,000 troops. 500 special forces troops were deployed to the Western Desert around Al-Mutana to look for weapons of mass destruction. So none of the Australian troops came into conflict. No one was killed in battle. 2 Australians died, but one was killed in a plane crash and was with the British forces. And the other one was a guy who was killed accidentally. So the other thing is Howard only committed for the invasion, for the active period of the invasion. So around about the time that Bush was, standing on USS Abraham Lincoln with the big mission accomplished sign behind him, that was the time when we were actually withdrawing the troops that we'd deployed for the invasion. So despite this, emotional and political closeness, he was very pragmatic. He knew that the Australian public were not in favour of the war. He knew that he had to manage his political environment and the media environment very, very carefully. And so there was a sort of almost a begrudging military commitment on our part, despite the fact that he would talk up, we've sent our best, 500 of our special forces, but they were very carefully deployed so that there'd be few casualties.
Mark, one of the interesting things, one of the other interesting things that comes out in the book is the way the 2 leaders managed their parties on both sides. Howard with an iron fist and iron determination, but he kept everyone together. Blair had a much more difficult task. What was going on in the UK Labor Party that Blair had to manage?
Yeah, I think Blair was able to manage. The Labour Party historically in the UK has a record of scepticism about and opposition to military interventionism, which is linked to its tradition, which it would see of anti-colonialism, not opposition to colonial involvements. So there was some deep-seated scepticism within the Labour Party, but ultimately I think Blair was able to manage it because the way in which he dominated the Labour Party in 2002 to 2003. And this reflected his record of electoral success. I mean, in 2002, when the build-up to war really starts, we're only less than 5 years on from the historic 1997 general election victory, when under Blair, Labour was returned to power after 18 years in opposition, after 4 successive general election defeats. And not just returned to power, but with an enormous parliamentary majority, almost 180 seats. And then he repeated the trick in the 2001 general election, returning Labour to power with an only slightly smaller majority of over 160 seats. So Labour dominated the national landscape under Blair, and many in the party, particularly the parliamentary party, were beholden to Blair because of that. Blair had apparently shown his ability to divine what the electorate wanted, communicate it to the electorate, and then deliver on it. Was it worth upsetting all that just over Iraq? And I think, prior to the invasion, that was the calculation that many in the parliamentary party made, and that also helps explain the rather limited dissent within cabinet on this issue.
Yeah. You've addressed the whole issue of, as you say, democratic governance in the book, and one of the important elements of that was the role of the public service in both sides. So I'm interested in exploring a bit with both of you the different ways in which the Westminster system in Westminster and in Canberra operated here. In the UK side, you had a much more extensive external examinations after the war of what went wrong than we did here. But how did you two see the functioning of the public service in both cases? Judy, I'll start with you, and then Mark.
When Howard first came to power, of course, there was almost the night of the long knives. He sacked he sacked a number of senior public servants. I think it was 6 departmental heads. It's not clear whether or not that had an impact, but you'd have to think that there must have been some kind of impact, because around, first of all, I think Howard was very, very wary of leaks. And what would normally happen would be, with an issue as big as going to war, you would normally ask all of the agencies, DFAT, PMNC, all sorts of agencies, to provide detailed briefs on the merits of going to war. But in fact, that never happened. The merits of going to war were never discussed in any official cabinet document. And I think part of that was because I don't think Howard wanted any document around examining the merits of going to war, because there was always a possibility that if the document existed, it could be leaked. And so to avoid leaks, there was this sort of distortion where all of the decisions about the war related to logistics rather than the merits of going to war, or even consideration of the impact on the Middle East of invading the country. And it was, all those decisions were made by the Security Committee of Cabinet, and those decisions had the status of full cabinet decisions. So cabinet itself, the bigger cabinet, never had an opportunity to discuss the substantive issue of going to war until 2 days before the invasion, when the decision was taken to go to war. So Howard, all that time, kept saying publicly, we haven't made up our mind. We haven't made a decision. We're going to wait. We'll wait and see if there's a second resolution in the UN, that might make such a move legal. Because he said that he supported a second resolution, but really when the second resolution didn't come, he nonetheless went ahead and supported the invasion, which should have been no surprise to anyone, because the troops had gone in January to the Middle East to acclimatise, just in case he might decide to go to war. And for some strange reason, the media seemed incapable of saying, Prime Minister, this is a bit of a stretch, isn't it, that you want us to think that you haven't made up your mind? But nonetheless, that was the whole atmosphere. And now, there were a couple of senior changes on the cusp of 2002, 2003, like head of PM&C changed, the head of the Defence Department changed. There may have been an issue there about with the change of personnel, you know, it always takes a while to settle in, but still there, you know, there was no substantive consideration of the merits of going to war. And I think, I mean, that worries me. And I wonder if the public service now is any less politicised than it was during that time. You know, if we're considering something like going to war now, that we would have a public service that would be so cowed that they would not, you know, put advice to the government to be wary, you know, to be careful, to think about the implications. Yeah, I think that's the biggest worry about the experience from the Iraq War.
And Mark, how did you conclude what did you conclude about the performance of the British civil service in their responsibilities during this period?
It's a very similar story to the one that Judy has just sketched out, where official advice was available but wasn't sought or was bypassed. Both into, but you know, that reflects the way in which I think the Iraq War was a long time coming, but the decision was taken in early mid 2002. So the government weren't looking for a kind of balance sheet analysis that weighed up the pros and cons of going to war. They weren't looking for that kind of expertise. The decision had been taken, and they were interested in official views that might query the decision. So where views were made clear from within the civil service, for example, the Foreign Office solicitors, the lawyers in the Foreign Office, this was ignored or overridden. The other key thing here, of course, is the role of intelligence, the way that secret intelligence was deemed to have, you know, validated the case for war. So there was no need for a wider input, and that's, you know, kind of unusual. It's not typical that you see intelligence at the forefront of public explanations about government actions in this way. So a very similar story to the one sketched out by Judy about small group decision making, excluding or ignoring the expertise available in the wider civil service.
Let's turn to the media, which is where you started, Judy, on all this. And this may be an unfair question, but you know, it's quite a long time. It's 20 years since this was all beginning. The media landscape has changed hugely in that period. The major newspaper groups have much less money than they did. Far fewer journalists, you know, much less able to hold the powerful to account if they ever did. And on the other hand, social media has become much more powerful. So do you think that the role of the media now would be different from the role of the media when you were when the Iraq War broke out?
I was disturbed that the media were not as curious as they might have been before the war. There were things like weapons inspectors' reports. There were, you know, there was other intelligence around that the media before the war could have read and checked up on, you know, to then be armed to ask probing questions of the government before the war. But after the war, I was unhappy too with the way the findings of the Joel Committee inquiry. The Joel Committee inquiry was the Joint Standing Committee of responsible for ASIO, ASIS and DSD. And they looked at the intelligence that the intelligence agencies gave to the government on Iraq. Now, they did a report that that found that basically all of the agencies, and at the risk of sort of taking up too much time, let me just read some of the advice that the Joel Committee found that our intelligence agencies had actually given to the government. That they basically said, you know, the scale and threat of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction was much less than a decade ago. Because of sanctions, Iraq's military capability remains limited, country's infrastructure still in decline, nuclear program unlikely, Iraq unlikely to have obtained fissile material, Iraq had no ballistic missiles. All of this advice, you know, no known chemical weapons production, no specific evidence of resumed biological weapons production. You know, all of this advice came from our intelligence agencies and went to the government of the time. So the Joel inquiry actually went on to say that the government put a case that was not reflective or indicative of the intelligence advice that they had received. So in essence, there was no case for war in the advice that the intelligence agencies gave the government. But a copy of the Joel inquiry or excerpts from the Joel inquiry were leaked to the media 2 weeks before release of the final report. Now, we know that there are only selected parts that were released because the headlines at the time of the leak were, you know, PM off the hook, no sexing up, you know, MPs fined. So for 2 weeks before the full Joel Committee report came out, for 2 weeks, people said, okay, Joel has found that there was no sexing up, you know, that the government's off the hook. And the Prime Minister and Downer stood up in the House and said that the report exonerated them. In fact, it did the exact opposite. It pointed to very specific instances where they had quite clearly exaggerated the intelligence and put a case that was not put to them by the intelligence agencies. Now, 2 points. One example of that was when Saddam Hussein's son-in-law, who had headed up all of the weapons of mass destruction programs in Iraq, he defected in 1995. And in his testimony, he said, yes, we did have a nuclear program, we did have chemical weapons program, and we did have a biological weapons program. However, Saddam Hussein ordered that all of those programs and everything be destroyed because he didn't want to be caught out by the weapons inspectors. And I myself, you know, his name was Hussein Kamal Hassan al-Majid. He said, I myself supervised the destruction of all of those weapons that we'd produced. And so there was no weapons program after that. Now, when John Howard was putting the case for war, he said, well, when Saddam Hussein's son-in-law defected and left Iraq, he put the case that they had, you know, nuclear weapons, biological weapons, chemical weapons. He's confirmed that Saddam Hussein has these weapons. And that was only half of the truth, because the other half of his statement was, but all of that has already been destroyed. So that was one example of the way in which Howard exaggerated, and the government exaggerated the intelligence. But there's another really clever thing that they did. By virtue of the material that was leaked, because, you know, how a journalist looks at the material and says, what's the story here? What's the angle? What's really going on? So in this instance, the journalist had a look and said, the story here is that O&A advice diverged from DIO. So Office of National Assessment's advice differed from Defence Intelligence, what is it? DIO? Organisation, sorry. Differed, and so that meant that O&A's advice had been politicised. So the big story was the politicisation of intelligence. And that's what journalists who read the report when it finally came out, They kept reading the report, looking for evidence that ONA's intelligence had been politicised. Now, in reality, what they failed to do was sit and look at the actual advice, and the actual advice meant that there was no case for war. So if John Howard had gone to war on the basis of intelligence advice, it was certainly not the advice of the Australian intelligence agencies.
I had another question for Mark, but I've already exceeded the 25 minutes, and I do want people to have an opportunity to ask questions. So I'll hold off my question to Mark until the unlikely event that there's silence from the audience, but there's an awful lot there that I'm sure people want to interrogate you both on.
So we've got time for some questions. We'll take some from the floor. Who would like to begin? Yes, James. Can you just let us know who you are? I'm afraid we'll have to leave the microphone there, so if you could speak up, James.
Yeah, James Wise, a former diplomat, Australian diplomat. I just wanted to ask you if you could put this into a bigger context at the time. One is, was this a period, I think it was, where it was still considered a fairly unipolar world? And to what extent does that explain, in our case, the attitude that Prime Minister Howard took and Britain's case that Blair took? And also specifically to Australia, to what extent do you think that our Prime Minister's thinking was affected by what seemed to be a strong desire at the time to have a free trade agreement with the United States?
Well, yes, there's no doubting that there was a free trade agreement that happened in the wake of our participation in the war. I don't know. I've heard some critics of that agreement saying that we didn't win a lot out of that agreement, but certainly it was a deliverable. You could present to the Australian public that you got a free trade agreement, even if the content was a bit elusive. But the unipolar world, I think the unipolar world affected the outlook of people in the US administration. And I think that certainly people like Cheney had said, well, you know, forget it, if nobody else is going with us, we'll go in on our own. And I think there are a lot of people concerned that might happen because I think there were people concerned that US standing in the international community might be undermined by them going in, you know, herring off, invading this country. But and I think actually,
Mark, do you have an answer on the unipolar world question?
Yeah, I think it very much was part of the unipolar moment. It was, you know, part of that period, and of course, America's latitude to intervene had been really extended by the experience of 9/11 and the fact that the international community was, you know, expecting US responses of various kinds. The journalist Patrick Coburn wrote a book called The Occupation about the war in Iraq and its aftermath. And in that, he wrote that a lot of the debate about why the US invaded Iraq tends to overcomplicate the issue. The US invaded Iraq because it could. By which he meant that there was a current within the Bush administration that felt there was unfinished business from 1991, that in 1991 the US should have marched on Baghdad. Here was an opportunity. There was no one going to get in the way. Now the job could be finished. And that was very much made possible by this unipolar moment.
Another question, Ernst?
Ernst Wilhelm, a member of the local branch. Thank you to both speakers. There's been a lot of debate in both countries about whether the Parliament should be involved in a decision to go to war. I think in the UK, a convention seemed to emerge that the Parliament should be involved. And I think in relation to proposed bombing of Syria, that didn't come off because the Parliament wouldn't pass the resolution. I feel that may have lapsed a little. In Australia, there have been bills from some of the minor parties seeking parliamentary approval. The Parliament spends hours debating the most minute pieces of legislation. Yet the most important decision any government makes, the decision to go to war, is made by the executive, by the Prime Minister sometimes, as Judy has said, without any democratic participation. What do you think are the prospects of a change in each country? A change to a more democratic process?
Unfortunately, both major parties have demonstrated a lack of political will to bring about a requirement that Parliament debate the issue. I mean, there's two ways you can do it. You could change the Defence Act so that parliamentary requirement, parliamentary approval is required for Australian forces to go overseas, or you can just adopt a convention. And I guess the third option might be for the Prime Minister to just simply say, no, let's debate this in Parliament. So at the moment, yes, both parties are demonstrating a lack of political will, but I don't know. I mean, if things sort of rumble around China, it may be that there are so many people in the country that feel really strongly about this not happening again, that people will at least start, the political leaders will start saying, no, we really do have to have a debate in the House. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean the outcome is going to be different because, you know, of course, the Prime Minister is the one who has the majority in the House. But at least the Australian public can hear the arguments of both sides and also have an opportunity to sort of lobby and make their views known. I don't know. Do you have some thoughts on that, Alan?
I do, but Mark, you
Well, I think in the case of the UK, the lessons of Iraq in a never again sense were much clearer and stronger in the immediate aftermath of the war. And the further away from that, the more that recedes into history, the less compelling the lessons are. So Tony Blair really created the convention that Parliament would have a say in whether British troops were committed abroad in 2003 and conceding a vote to Parliament prior to the military commitments in Iraq. David Cameron, as the questioner mentions, also went to Parliament in 2013 to ask for its approval for the use of British military force in Syria, and Parliament did not support it. But the lesson drawn from that by Theresa May's government was, well, you don't go to Parliament and ask them for that then. If you want to commit British military force, you do it and claim executive authority. But under what circumstances and what kind of commitment should Parliament be asked to support or approve British military commitments? In the case of Cameron in Syria and then Theresa May in Syria, this wasn't about boots on the ground. This was airstrikes. This was maybe special forces. So it remains unclear what triggers the requirement for parliamentary approval. So it's a bit of a grey area at the moment. And I think it's certainly true to say that the further the experience of Iraq recedes into history, the less compelling is generally regarded the case for Parliament to need to authorise it explicitly is regarded as being.
Alan, did you have one?
yeah, I'm not. I haven't written a book about this. No, my view is really that the important thing is the parliamentary debate here. And one of my criticisms of successive Australian governments since the 1960s or 70s really has been the absence of the use of Parliament as a forum to articulate the views of the government and to have an active debate about foreign policy and national security issues. So I'm not sure that you will. I can't think of circumstances in which a government would bring to Parliament a resolution for the commitment of Australian troops abroad without being absolutely certain that it was going to get that through, because if it didn't get that through, the government itself would collapse. But I do really think it's important that the Parliament itself be used, not because of the parliamentarians, but because of the way in which this would help get things out to the Australian public.
One more from the room, Yelena.
I've got two different questions. One to Dr. Irina Zabortseva. I'll ask it on behalf of my previous affiliation.
You can speak up for Mark's benefit, at least.
I've got two different questions, one to Mark, one to Judith. Mark, you've mentioned several fundamental important decisions that drove UK to take this decision. Democracy, security, and strategic relationships with the US, were there any geoeconomic and geopolitical other interests that actually contributed to the decision of UK to go into war? Judith, also another question. When you highlighted Howard took this decision without any consultation with any other departments, I was just also thinking, not from only public perspective, but also even from his own perspective, wasn't it in his interest to share responsibility and not to take all the blame related to such important decision? Why he wasn't considering this risk? So, thank you.
I'll answer first,
Right.
Mark, if that's okay. Look, I think that, well, I mean, Howard always argued right up until the point, up until 2 days before the war, that he hadn't made up his mind, that he hadn't decided that troops would go. The only reason why we know, or not the only reason, but one of the reasons why we believe that he made the decision in June 2002 when he was visiting the US was because he says in his memoirs that he had a discussion with Bush, and Bush knew that for political reasons he couldn't give an undertaking, but he had every reason to believe that we would be there, that we would support him. So they were Howard's own words. Around about the same time, our defence officials went to the US and were involved in Iraq war planning. And so, you know, everything started kind of clicking into gear as if the decision had been made, although, you know, Howard insisted that the decision hadn't been made. But ultimately, yes, he made that decision with Cabinet 2 days before the invasion. But in terms of sharing, he made sure that his party, particularly Cabinet members, were behind him 100%. Now, there are some issues like refugees, where there were at least 3 or 4 Liberal members of Parliament who'd be out, backbenchers, critical of the government because of their policy, but no backbencher, nobody was critical of the government over Iraq. And that's largely because he spent an awful lot of time working those guys, working the party, having cups of tea, talking to people, listening to them express their views, you know, venting, all the rest. But ultimately, winning people's support to keep their reservations about Iraq to themselves. So he did end up with very strong party support.
I think there was a first part to that question.
Sorry.
As well, Mark, on the geopolitical elements.
Geoeconomic.
Geoeconomic, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the UK, the reasons for the reasons to go to war with Iraq in 2003 were around regime change, and they were an extension of the logic of humanitarian intervention and the case for humanitarian intervention, which had been made in the 1990s in the context of former Yugoslavia and elsewhere, and where the British government had intervened. And I don't doubt that Blair believed wholeheartedly about the threat posed by Saddam in terms of weapons of mass destruction, and also the fact that, you know, this was an unpleasant regime and the human rights situation was dire, and that, you know, the human rights agenda was part of Blair's vision for regime change. So I don't think there were geopolitical reasons in the classic geopolitics sense. You know, ironically, the geopolitical considerations, I think, second order considerations, would have related more to the UK than to Iraq. They would have been about displaying Britain's reliability as a partner, able and willing to deploy military force in pursuit of shared Western objectives, about Britain demonstrating the need for it to be one of the P5 at the United Nations, even into the 21st century, about demonstrating that it was a key partner, in NATO by dint of this ability to deploy military force abroad. So I don't see the actual, Iraq itself as being about geopolitics. I think many of Britain's key allies in the Middle East would have been horrified at the idea that Britain was going to war to introduce democracy in these states and in the Middle East. I think it was more about Blair's signing up to this vision about humanitarian intervention and the permissibility of humanitarian intervention under certain circumstances.
All right, we might take a question from one of our online viewers. John Blaxland from the ANU is asking, in light of the diminishment of American power since 2003, in relative terms anyway, do you think Australia, do the speakers think Australia and Britain have learned much from that? Would we follow a similar line today if we were asked to participate in another war, perhaps closer to home? Well, thinking music there, isn't it?
Well,
Would you like to have a go, Jill?
well, I would really hope that we've learnt something from the Iraq conflict, that we need to think about the consequences. And although, I mean, in many ways, Howard came out of it relatively unscathed in political terms, and his interests approach to the relationship probably served him better than Blair's, deep commitment. But I would hope that our interests are that we can work out what our interests are independent of the alliance, that we can see ourselves as having distinct interests. And you have to think, if there were to be a conflict in the region, we definitely do have our own interests. It's not in our interest to have conflict with our, major trading partner. So, yes, would we do it again? I don't know. I mean, yes, the problem is, the bureaucracy is probably more politicized than it was. The media is probably more hollowed out than it was. I think our politicians on both sides are perhaps lacking even less political courage than they had before. Yes, it is a worry. But I don't have an answer.
What about Mark?
I think one of the themes of the book really is the way in which democratic institutions can be unable to prevent determined executives from going to war. What we do in the book really is isolate a series of key variables and show how, under certain circumstances, these can lead to this situation. But the book does suggest as well that it does require a very specific set of circumstances for this to happen. A number of things have to be present. So could it happen again? Yes, absolutely, it could happen again. I think that, the case of Iraq shows that democratic institutions that are meant to act as a brake, as a check, can prove ineffective under certain circumstances. I mean, one thing I'd add to that, which is kind of follows up Alan's earlier question about the media, is one thing that I think would be very different today if an Iraq kind of situation arose again, is that I don't think the UK intelligence agencies would be able to claim a monopoly on wisdom once their intelligence was used in the public domain. I think the changes in the field of journalism and social media in the years since 2002 to 3 will make a big difference. And if there were to be a similar case now, where the government sought to use intelligence in a public way to make a case for war, I would expect that very quickly that material would come under scrutiny and challenge from groups like Bellingcat. I don't think national intelligence agencies have that kind of monopoly on wisdom that they had or claimed in 2002 to 3.
All right, Desmond. Speak up, please.
Mark, my name is Desmond Woods. I'm a member of the Council of the AIIA ACT branch. You've been talking about the humanitarian agenda that Blair had, and very convincing it was too. In 1991, I was a staff officer on the staff of General Sir Rupert Smith as we entered Kuwait from Iraq. And of course, we cut the highway of hell and killed an awful lot of Iraqis. And then we were thoroughly sick of war and were pleased it was over. But over the succeeding weeks, we learned to our dismay that having not forbidden Saddam Hussein to use helicopters, he was massacring the Shiite Marsh Arab rebellion that rose in the expectation that we were going to keep going to Basra. And we had a profound sense of guilt over that, because these were people dying because they relied on us to keep coming and deal with this despot who was not of their tribe or of their making. In the north, we imposed safe havens to allow people to escape from the horror that he was trying to impose on them, similar to the gassing of the women and children at Halabja in the 1980s. So all this plays into this question of the humanitarian agenda. If Saddam Hussein hadn't misplayed his hand completely in terms of the Western perception, it would be much harder to have justified the invasion. Though I have no brief for the decision to go in, I'm not convinced that there weren't some fairly decent motives for trying to get rid of that particular individual. He was, after all, starving his own people, using money that was made available despite the sanctions for his own palace building rather than for children's hospitals. It was a thoroughly unpleasant piece of work. And I don't think we should exonerate him retrospectively from a great deal of responsibility for what happened. What are your views?
Yeah, I agree. And this is the dilemma of around humanitarian military intervention. When you see wrongs occurring in the world, how do you respond? And during the 1990s, in light of the experience of Iraq and then around the former Yugoslavia, but also in parts of Africa, there develops a consensus that principles of universal human rights should take precedence over principles of state sovereignty, and there were circumstances under which it was right to intervene. The difficulty is, of course, how you ensure that the consequences of intervention represent an improvement on the situation into which you intervened. And that is the classic humanitarian intervention dilemma. It's very difficult. Once state structures are dismantled, it's very difficult to rebuild them. So there are no easy answers. I don't doubt at all. I wouldn't want to have lived in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. I don't doubt for 1 minute the extent of human rights abuse and the denial of basic freedoms and liberties that we take for granted. But I think really it's incumbent on the international community to look at all the options and the consequences of those options in looking to respond to that.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Yes, Brian.
Brian Ely, fellow council member. To both of you, what amount of tic-tacking was done between Howard and Blair, if any, and how much did what Britain was going to do and what Australia was going to do influence the two countries about whether they would follow the US?
I'll answer for on the Howard side. Look, I don't know exactly how much tic-tacking there was between Howard and Blair directly, but certainly there was a lot of tic-tacking between the Prime Minister's office and Michael Lestrange, who was the High Commissioner at the time, and also Michael Thorley was the ambassador in Washington. Now, that meant that Howard had, these are two former staffers or people who'd worked very, very closely with Howard. And so he had a very, very close relationship with them and had got very, very direct access to information. But it was that intelligence that Howard used to justify the war. It wasn't the intelligence that his own intelligence agencies were briefing him on. And so that suggests that certainly when it came to the argument for war, there was a great deal of coordination between the three capitals, and certainly in terms of the script, as it were, the defence of the war after the fact, each leader uses exactly the same words. Yeah.
Mark, have you got a comment on that?
I think that's absolutely right. I just agree with Judy on that. Yeah.
Any further questions? Okay. Alan, are you happy to wrap up?
I am, well, no, I'm not deeply unhappy to wrap up. Yeah, look, that brings us almost exactly to 7 o'clock. And the question that I was going to ask Mark and Judy before was, in fact, the one that has already come up. I mean, you end your introductory chapter with the question, how far do the combined lessons of 2002-3 mean similar scenario can't arise again? You've given a clearer answer tonight, I think, than in the final chapter of the book. But it does underline again the point I began with, that this is not simply remote history. There are lessons here for the way in which we deal with contemporary problems as well. So it only remains for me to thank Mark, particularly coming all that way via Zoom from London, and Judy for being here tonight, for writing the book, and to urge all of you to get onto the Palgrave Macmillan website to order it. Please join me in thanking them both.
On behalf of the branch, thank you to Alan for agreeing to engage in conversation this evening. Our next event, yes? Next event is in the middle of June. John Tillerman, a member of the branch, will be discussing nuclear disarmament, the treaty and so on. So we hope that you can come along here or get online. We'd like to see you. Thank you.